In the not-too-distant future, a powerful solar flare swept across Earth, causing 95% of humanity to perish. The few survivors contracted flare syndrome, a disease that drove people mad and slowly turned them into walking corpses. Human civilization began to enter a dark age. In order for Viken to develop an antidote, they select subjects from the immunized population and then send the children into the maze to be studied. However, there was an unknown side to their operations. Just after escaping the maze, Thomas and his companions were taken to a heavily guarded shelter. Jansen, the person in charge, told them that the outside world had become a scorched wasteland overrun by zombies, and only the shelter was safe. There were comfortable beds and ample food, along with many young people like themselves. This meant there wasn't just one maze. They were all rescued by Jansen from different mazes. The boy before them, Eris, who didn't talk much, was one of the first to arrive here. His face bore an expression of fear, a sentiment Thomas could feel as well. Periodically, Jansen would take some of the children away, claiming to send them to a new home. But after careful observation, Thomas realized that things were not as simple as they seemed. One night, as Thomas was preparing to sleep, he heard a noise from under his bed. It was Eris. Together, they crawled through the ventilation ducts to find themselves above a laboratory. It appeared that human experiments were being conducted. To uncover the truth, Thomas deliberately caused a commotion during mealtime and took the opportunity to steal a guard's keycard. At night, he and Eris sneaked into the laboratory. The image in front of them sent chills down the backs of the two men. Some were soaked in potion that had mutated. Some were hanging in midair with countless tubes sticking out of their bodies. The children sent to the new home were actually being used as specimens for extracting an antidote, their bodies being drained. Just then, Jansen unexpectedly entered the lab, fortunately not noticing the two of them. Unexpectedly, Jansen turned out to be under Ava's command, with the doctor urging him to speed up the experiment or else find someone to replace him. To save his job, Jansen decided to start with the most recently arrived child. He rushed back to the dorm, tore off the bed sheet, and secured the dormitory door. Meanwhile, Jansen was coming in the direction of the dormitory with the potion, but he was still a step too late. By the time Jansen entered the dorm, several had already escaped, even taking a female doctor hostage. Then, Miho knocked down a guard. Thomas picked up a weapon, and the doctor led them to Teresa. Soon, the pursuers caught up. Thomas picked up a chair, smashed the glass, and they all desperately sprinted towards the exit. But the door card had already failed. Jansen caught up at that moment. Thomas immediately rushed over to hold him back, buying time for his friends to open the door. But after all the effort, the iron door didn't budge. At the critical moment, Eris opened the iron door from the outside, and after his friends safely passed through, Thomas dropped the weapon and turned to run towards the closing iron door. Thus began their adventure through the scorched earth. To shake off the pursuers, they crossed a hill and then hid in an abandoned shopping mall. There, they collected some useful supplies, and Miho even found a generator that seemed to still work. However, the lights turning on woke the nearby zombies. Fortunately, Miho reacted quickly, using an iron rod to take down the zombies. They ran all the way to meet up with their companions, but the zombies behind them kept increasing, leaving them stunned. They could only run while desperately fighting off the zombies. Having finally escaped, they encountered a locked gate. Luckily, it was just a wooden door, which they kicked open after a few tries. But just then, Winston was caught by a zombie. They worked together to pull him out, but couldn't avoid being scratched by the zombies. Seeing that Winston really didn't have the strength, a few people had to hide in a corner for the night. The next morning, they carried the injured Winston into the crumbling city. The world outside had already fallen apart, and they began to miss the maze. Just then, Thomas suddenly heard the roar of an airplane, and they quickly found cover to hide. Thomas knew in his heart that Viken would not give up looking for them and had to plan the way forward. At that moment, Thomas suddenly remembered the conversation between Jansen and Ava. They mentioned a resistance organization named the Right Arm, allegedly hidden in the mountains, dedicated to rescuing children taken for experiments. Finding them was their only hope for survival. Yet, the journey would undoubtedly be treacherous, as they had a long way to go. They pressed on, all the while caring for the injured Winston. Soon after, Winston began vomiting black blood, his abdomen undergoing necrosis. Rather than waiting to mutate, he chose a swift end. After a brief goodbye, Winston took his own life. They continued forward, drawing closer to the mountains, but after days and nights of walking, they still hadn't left the desert, and their water supply had run out. Exhausted, they collapsed into a sleep in the desert. After an unknown time, Thomas woke up to find lights twinkling in the distance, excitedly waking his companions. But before they could move, the sky suddenly lit up with lightning, and a sandstorm approached. As they ran for their lives, a lightning bolt struck Miho to the ground. They helped Miho into a dark warehouse. Thankful the strike wasn't fatal, Miho soon regained consciousness. Just then, a horde of zombies appeared in the warehouse. Fortunately, they were chained up, temporarily safe. A woman emerged from the zombies and led them inside. Jorge is the so-called manager around here. Upon discovering the identities of the few, he was over the moon. Like finding a treasure trove, selling them to the Viken company would net a decent income. After the others left, Jorge discussed a deal with Thomas. It turns out he also wanted to join the resistance, and these kids were his bargaining chip. But then, Jansen arrived with soldiers. Thomas had no choice but to agree to search for the resistance together. They escaped via a rope one after the other, but at a crucial moment, Brenda, going back for personal belongings, was blocked by soldiers. Luckily, Thomas was too valuable for them to act rashly. Jorge had already set up bombs, and a violent explosion ensued, causing the warehouse to collapse. They jumped down an elevator shaft, narrowly escaping, but with the only exit sealed. They lifted a metal cover to proceed through the dark tunnel, facing zombies ahead. They had to brace themselves. After a while, no zombies appeared, only a rat, just as they lowered their guard. Zombies in the bushes began to awaken, forcing them to run for their lives. Finding no escape, they climbed up a decrepit building, with zombies in hot pursuit. Overwhelmed, Brenda accidentally fell onto a glass roof. Trying to stand, the glass cracked further. At the same time, a zombie charged down, attacking Brenda ferociously. Seeing her about to give in, Thomas grabbed a steel rod. He shattered the glass in the nick of time, pulling Brenda to safety, but her feet had been scratched by the walkers, and she could only grit her teeth and wrap the wounds with a cloth as she limped on. After crossing several streets, they arrived at a bar. To enter, they had to drink a special brew. Thomas was hesitant, but Brenda drank it, so Thomas followed suit. They split up to find a man named Marcus. The drink had hallucinogenic effects, blurring Thomas's vision between Brenda and Teresa. Eventually, Thomas collapsed from exhaustion. When he awoke, everyone had regrouped, and they had captured Marcus. Turns out, the bar owner was Marcus himself. Under Jorge's violent interrogation, Marcus revealed the Resistance's location. His prized car was also taken by Jorge, but they didn't get far before finding the canyon road blocked, forcing them to stop and investigate. They were ambushed by a sniper. Jorge quickly took out a bomb, ready to fight back, but before they could act, they were overpowered. Luckily, Eris recognized them. The two had been in the same maze as Eris and were later rescued by the Resistance. They led Thomas and his group to the Resistance camp. Just then, Brenda suddenly fainted. Seeing this, Vince, the leader of the rebels, decided to execute Brenda on the spot. It was only when Dr. Mary stepped in to stop it that Vince put away the gun in his hand. Mary had once worked at Viken with Thomas, and she knew the whole experiment was a sham. The research department wasn't working on a cure at all but was extracting it from the children. Because this potion can only be extracted, not replicated, Mary used Thomas's serum to temporarily stabilize Brenda's condition, but it was only a palliative solution, unable to eradicate the problem completely. Sitting atop a hill, Thomas and his companions lamented the hard-won freedom they now enjoyed, free at last from their days of fleeing. But, to their shock, Teresa turned out to be a traitor. She secretly contacted Jansen, who approached with an army. Thomas was powerless this time. He could only watch as the enemy's warplanes launched a fierce attack on their camp. After a barrage of bombings, the camp was engulfed in flames. Thomas knew they couldn't win this war, so he told Brenda and Jorge to leave quickly, hiding a bomb on himself, ready to die with the enemy. The mastermind behind the scenes, Ava, also arrived. Seeing his chance, Thomas pulled out the bomb. Joined by his friends, they were the most important property of Viken, and the other side didn't dare to do anything rash. Meanwhile, Brenda and others returned to reignite the battle. Quick to respond, Thomas threw the bomb, blowing the soldiers away. A furious Jansen tried to finish Thomas but was timely saved by Brenda from afar. With everyone's concerted efforts, the enemy was finally forced to retreat. Tragically, Miho was shot and captured by the enemy. Watching the departing aircraft, Thomas was in despair. Thomas decided to rescue Miho, essentially a suicide mission, because as long as Viken Company existed, they would never have peace. Touched by Thomas's bravery, his friends decided to join him in a full-on counterattack.